President-elect Donald Trump has threatened to impose 100% trade tariffs on BRICS member states should they decide to create their own currency or to trade in a currency other than the dollar. South Africa has stepped out and clarified that a BRICS currency is not on the table and is not part of the discussions documents. However, BRICS nations are discussing about methods through which they can trade with their own respective domestic currencies. For more on this, we're now joined by Dr. Oscar van Heerden, Senior Research Fellow for Diplomacy and Leadership at the University of Johannesburg. Dr. van Heerden, thank you so much for your time. Really do appreciate it. 100% trade tariffs, that sounds implausible. How much credibility or how much credence should we give Donald Trump's tirade?
Well, look, I mean, he is the president-elect of the largest economy in the world. And obviously, you don't want to be on the wrong side of such an economy. But having said that, at the same time, I think President-elect Trump should also be wary about the kind of threats that he's making. Tariffs is a two-way stream. People trade with each other. There's goods and services you want from me. There's goods and services I want from you. And there's some mutual respect that needs to be there. If there is indeed an imposition of 100% tariffs, I think then those on the receiving end, such as South Africa, will be forced to look at other markets, will be forced to try and find other markets that those goods and services can, because it will be quite an imposition. As to whether Donald Trump's administration will actually do this, I find that hard to believe because, we know that Trump is full of threats, but at the same time, he must be careful to think that the USA can stand on its own as an isolated island. Because if you impose tariffs on BRICS countries, including South Africa, those BRICS countries will obviously respond with also tariffs from the United States. Goods and services coming in. So it's not a very good place to be. And I think diplomacy is going to be required between these countries and the Trump administration to try and resolve it.
Yeah, let's get to the heart of what this debate is about. It's ultimately a fear, hysterical fear by Donald Trump and Americans alike that the world is de-dollarizing, so to speak. That is to say that the world is putting the dollar aside and choosing to use other currencies to trade amongst them. The fear is that that would mean that the dollar is no longer in as high demand as it is, as a currency tool, as a currency trade instrument, and therefore due to a drop in its demand, potentially a drop in its value. But it's almost near impossible for that to truly happen if the fundamentals of trade and trade policy is not addressed, and that is to say price setting. Ultimately, you and I can trade in whatever currency we want to, Dr. van Heerden, but if we have to rely on price setting being denominated in dollar terms, it still matters that you and I have dollar reserves. So whether China and Russia trade in their respective currency or South Africa and Brazil trade in our respective currencies, it doesn't matter if the price setting doesn't happen in our respective currencies. What would it take for the world's reserve currency, the dollar, to be dislodged as the central price-setting tool for global trade and commodities?
Well, you're hitting it right on the head. The truth of the matter is that in the case of the USA, you can't have your cake and eat it. People will not be having the conversation about moving away from the dollar if it was not for the successive US governments and administrations weaponizing the dollar, imposing sanctions on countries. Because of the fact that there is this international reserve currency, the United States have in recent years weaponized the dollar against Venezuela, against North Korea, against Iran, all countries that they purport that it's autocratic, it's not democratic, and so on and so forth. But the truth is that the world has really integrated financially in a much, much better way over the last decade or so. And so Trump, the threats that's coming from the US is such that the dollar, if it wants to have the respect the dollar once had, then it cannot be weaponized. Then it cannot be that you are threatened with sanctions and tariffs and so on and so forth. So for BRICS countries, China, Brazil, India, and so forth, Russia, they are looking at a mechanism that says when we trade with each other, Can we use our own local currencies? Yes, prices are still set in terms of the dollar, but there is that ratio between the local currency and the dollar. And the more you trade in your local currency that is backed up by your own resources, the more your currency carries more weight. And so, yes, the process is named de-dollarization, but the truth of the matter is, Oliver, the dollar is going to be around for a very long time still. I think the USA needs to do some introspection as to whether if they want that currency to remain their foreign reserve currency globally, then they need to give it and afford it the necessary respect and not weaponize it. Otherwise, people will seek alternatives.
Let me reframe the political question I'm asking here. India is the world's biggest exporter of rice, yet the global commodity price for rice is set in the dollar. What will it take for the global commodity price of rice to be set in rupees, for instance, given that India is the biggest exporter of rice? What will it take to decentralize the price spotting of dollar instruments?
Further decline of the US empire. That's the simple answer. A further decline, because if we look in history, why the British pound lost that position and before it other currencies, it's because the empire came to an end. And so these are desperate measures from a declining superpower, a declining empire that Trump is wanting to hold on and still place first. Instead of saying that we are moving into a multilateral environment where all currencies are important, where all resources are important, and if you continue to threaten, if you continue to use the stick, then countries are going to move away from you. So in terms of why and how that should change for India, for example, as the USA decline in power and influence and more threats and sanctions, that is when the Indian government is going to decide to move away from the dollar, which they can. There will be consequences, of course. In our case, with our AGOA and other agreements, there will be consequences, but it's necessary consequences. And I think our own consumers, our own farmers, and our own industry must be aware that this is not the South African government creating this problem. It is the United States.
And a different dynamic to this conversation, equally as important, is that often diplomacy and geopolitics is a function of perception, and oftentimes it is a perception measured in terms of strength. The stronger we perceive of you, the more important we think of you, and the more we center you in our global existence and globalization interaction. If countries decentralize the dollar in their trade instruments, not in the price setting necessarily, as that takes global reform, it means that they, one, trust each other more, there's a perception of strength amongst them, and there's a perception of weakness on part of the US. How much of the perception is what the US is fearing?
They're fearing the perception. You are absolutely correct. But they're also fearing the practical steps that's being taken. Look, even though BRICS profess that there is no such process of de-dollarization, it's for the first time that a group of countries, a significant group of countries, are coming together and beginning a conversation that says, this dollar is a problem. If it is going to continue to be used in this way, then we need to move away from it. We need to find alternatives. And the fact that that conversation is happening in a real way, looking at international financial institutions, looking at trade and trade relations, looking at commodities and so on, that is what is sending warning signals to Washington, D.C.
This, however, places South Africa in a very awkward position should any of it happen. Donald Trump has been known to follow through on his threats. He threatened tariffs against China, and he so imposed in his first administration, likely to do so in his second administration. South Africa is a member of BRICS, but South Africa is also a beneficiary of AGOA, which is not a reciprocal trade benefit. It is a one-directional trade benefit where South Africa benefits thereof. American businesses in South Africa create 600,000 jobs or more than that annually and contribute billions in trade value to South Africa's GDP. Should Donald Trump go ahead, it may well also means the withdrawal or the expulsion of South Africa from AGOA. How difficult is it to maneuver those dynamics and sensitivities under a Donald Trump administration, as we've seen President Ramaphosa being at pains to balance those dynamics under the Joe Biden administration in the last 2 to 3 years, when U.S.-South Africa relations were not always the greatest?
Yeah, look, it's going to require some fancy footwork diplomatically. This is the game of diplomacy. We've sent the new Ambassador Ibrahim Rasool to the US to precisely do this fancy footwork. It's not going to be easy, of course, but I do want to leave you with this issue, because there's a lot of voices that says the South African government somehow is not handling this correctly. Why are they in bed with China and Russia and so on and so forth? But the truth is, what will we do tomorrow, Oliver, when the Chinese threaten us and say we are going to withdraw and we are going to put tariffs because your foreign policy is not going in a particular direction? Because this is not just us having an issue with the Americans. This is us wanting to exercise, as South Africa, our foreign policy objectives. Just like China is the #1 trading partner with the United States, so too is China the #1 trading partner with South Africa. Why is it that it works for you, but it doesn't work for us? So, I just want to bring the parallel. At the moment, it's Donald Trump with his wayward politics that is threatening us. Do this or else. But what if tomorrow it is Xi Jinping? Or tomorrow it is Modi? Or after that, the European Union? Are we supposed to kowtow and have a flexible foreign policy because we want to satisfy everyone? This is really where the issue lies. And so it's going to require diplomacy, it's going to require engagement. And the USA must also ask themselves, what is important for them geostrategically? Do they want to irritate the entire African continent, including South Africa, and give it a free rein for the whole continent to run to the east, for example, to China, have more deals with Russia? Or do they want to maintain some modicum of soft power, that they have influence over African leaders, where there's mutual respect, etc., etc.? Very difficult questions, Oliver, but this is the fancy footwork that is required within diplomatic circles.
It is not uncommon in geopolitics for countries, particularly countries that perceive themselves to be powerful brokers, to place ultimatums on countries that want to associate with them. China's done it before. If you look, for instance, in China-Taiwan disputes, China-Tibetan disputes, South Africa had to choose a side. And ultimately, in the mid-90s, President Mandela chose China. The US has similarly done the same, where it's given ultimatums to countries. You're either with us or against us. How close to the precipice of an ultimatum is South Africa in its various trade relations, geopolitical relations, and diplomatic relations?
As far as I'm concerned, come G20 next year, Trump is going to come here and give that ultimatum to President Ramaphosa. You are either with us or against us, and suffer the consequences. Because as you said earlier, there's an old adage within international relations. The strong, the mighty do what they want, and the weak suffer what they must. And unfortunately, this is the politics of Donald Trump.
Yeah. Dr. Oscar van Heerden, thank you so much for your time. Really do appreciate it. Dr. van Heerden is a senior fellow for African diplomacy and leadership at the University of Johannesburg.